This is Democracy,
a podcast about the people of the United States.
A podcast about citizenship.
About engaging with politics and the world around you.
A podcast about educating yourself on today's important issues.
And how to have a voice in what happens next.
Welcome to our new episode of This is Democracy. This week we are discussing the crisis in Ukraine, what looks like the terrible possibility of war from a Russian invasion of Ukraine, or at the very least more violence and threatening challenges surrounding this country. Ukraine is a country, of course, that has received extensive American aid since the end of the Cold War. It has been a close ally of the United States, and it is a country that has sought membership in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and various other Western institutions. We confront today, as many of our listeners know, the challenge of maintaining and continuing to pursue democracy in Ukraine with threatening countries, particularly Russia, around it. We're joined by a journalist who is covering these events on the ground in Ukraine. She's one of the foremost Ukrainian journalists known to the United States and other communities. This is Nataliya Gumenyuk. She's a Ukrainian author, documentary filmmaker, and journalist. She's joined our podcast before. She specializes in conflict reporting, human rights, and foreign affairs. She's the founder of the Public Interest Journalism Lab, aimed at popularizing public journalism and overcoming polarization. And she's been reporting on events from Ukraine for various news outlets, National Public Radio, and others. And we're fortunate to have her with us today. Nataliya, thank you for joining us.
Good to talk to you.
Before we turn to our discussion with Nataliya, we have, of course, Zachary's scene-setting poem. Zachary, what's the title of your poem for this podcast?
When the War Starts.
Let's hear it.
When the war starts. Maybe you are standing in a cupboard. Maybe you are walking in the square under the lindens, trying to make sense of the silence. Nowadays, it has become disturbing, conspicuous. It is sunny, of course, as it always is, and almost it is any other day. Maybe you are standing in a cupboard reaching for a jar of pickles. Maybe you are standing on a street corner looking up at a lamppost. Maybe you are holding her hand and staring into her eyes longingly as the train pulls away and follows its own gaze into the mountainside. The train whistles, as it always does, and maybe it reminds you of a proverb. You don't wish to be caught repeating such droll indecencies now, not on a day like this. Maybe, when you at last hear sirens wailing in the boulevard, or bombs flying in between the rafters of the apartment block across the square, it is dark already. Maybe, when you will have understood what it means to be hungry, when you will have wandered silent, ruined streets following breadcrumbs, night has already fallen. Maybe it is dark already, but more likely it is bright, simply bright, and you must stare at the fires across the way and breathe in the smoke of a human being. You look out over the square into the eyes of your neighbor as she collapses at 2/4 time into non-existence. When the war starts, maybe you are reaching for the ketchup in the walk-in pantry. Maybe you are kicking stones along the avenue in the mid-morning sun. Maybe you are looking up or looking down or looking backwards over your shoulder into the eyes of the man you must kill, who must kill you 16 months later. Forget that you were here when, if you tell your grandchildren, you already knew that it had started. Yes, you were waiting at the window. Yes, you looked her in the eye. Yes, you knew already that there was simply nothing to be done.
It's very moving, Zachary. What is your poem about?
My poem is really about the ways in which, when we least expect it, we can be thrust into war, violence. And it's really about trying to remain vigilant against that, but also how deeply devastating war can be and how vital it is that we do everything we can to prevent it.
It's really important to remember that point. Nataliya, the events in Ukraine the last few months and the events around Ukraine seem almost like a slow, inevitable descent into war. Is that what it feels like on the ground there?
I would say it doesn't feel really like that. I think there are a couple of clarifications to be made. It's true that Ukraine is at war with Russia for the last years, and Russia is in control of part of the Ukrainian territory in Crimea and in the eastern part of the country. However, what we have today, it's not really the crisis in Ukraine. Honestly saying, there is nothing happening in Ukraine for the last couple of months apart from, like anxiety, which we have, or the preparation of the military or people to be on alert. What we experience today is the threat to Ukraine. However, the problem is at this moment between more or less Russia and the West, because the demand of Kremlin today, they do not really want anything from Ukraine. From what they say, it's not really about even like Ukraine as a country. It's about the spheres of influence. It's more or less about the returning to the history like it was before the Soviet Union had collapsed. And that makes this situation quite weird, because I'm following I'm covering a lot of international conflicts. I'm covering the conflict in Ukraine. So I do quite well what is the war on the ground, like the very classical, what people imagine in how they see it in the news or in the movies. But now we really have the thing that the story is about Ukraine. The threat is to Ukraine, but it's done in this direction because that's what Russia can. Since Ukraine is not a NATO member and there is no any alliance, there is no any obligation of any country to support Ukraine in possible battle with Russia, which is of course an international military global superpower. It's Ukraine which will unfortunately might slide into the war if there won't be success in these negotiations. But the problem is it's very hard to find what this success could be.
That's so insightful, and it's important for our listeners to understand that, as you say, the primary demands from Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, have been demands upon the United States and NATO, demands to make a pledge never to allow Ukraine into NATO, and various other demands he's made. They generally are not demands on Ukraine at this moment. What does that feel like for citizens of Ukraine to, in a sense, be pawns in this chessboard, as you put it, of great power conflict over spheres of influence, a very historical phenomenon? Of course, Ukraine has been in this position before. So do Ukrainian citizens recognize that, and do they see this as part of that long history or something new?
I think it's totally new, because I'm, from this school of thought of journalists who think that people matters, the human security is paramount, and in a lot of situation of conflict there is always the room of maneuver. There is always something which depends on us. Maybe you can de-escalate, or there would be some political solution. But this is and quite often it was the case. We are in a long process of the conflict resolution with Russia for 8 years. And interesting enough, also worth it to mention that for a couple of years, the Ukrainian government was really pushing the policy towards de-escalation, towards different kind of the political solutions and negotiations. So I was always insisting that there is a lot Ukraine can do, yet unfortunately not in this stage. And yes, people do feel about that. It partially makes people a bit paralyzed about the actions, because it's not very much you can do in this situation. Of course, there are obvious things which I still think probably say that Ukrainian diplomats are there, they are talking to the governments, they are looking into different ways how the Western alliances can help Ukraine, whether there would be military support, weaponry, or financial support, or just unity, or enforcing the sanctions towards Russia. There is, of course, the clear things which the Ukrainian army should do, be on alert, be prepared to look at different scenarios. But there is quite few things what really Ukrainians can do. Like there is no will of this war, neither in the larger society nor among the political class. So there is no need, for instance, for the journalists to write somewhere like "Stop the war." Like, nobody wants the war here. There is, but at the same time, I won't be really, let's say, using this term of being a pawn on the global chessboard, because in the end, we should admit that some countries are bigger, some countries are smaller, some countries are capable to defend itself, and Ukraine is partially capable to defend itself, and that's what Ukraine is probably will do in case of the invasion. However, there are some disproportional threat, because it's true that some countries are that big. That's why, therefore, the international alliance are created. And being now in position when Ukraine is not the part of NATO, it's very hard what Ukraine really can do. So it doesn't feel like, the West betrayed Ukraine. But there is a paradox of the situation that Ukraine could be protected if it is a part of any international alliance. But that's exactly which makes the fact that it's not there gives the Russia the opportunity to do that, a capability to risk. But at the same time, of course, we understand that there is no easy logical way out, because the demands of Moscow are just against international security, international order, the idea of the free will of the people. So, for instance, how Ukraine can influence the idea on how the NATO should be built. Russia demands that the voice of the people don't matter, but this is such an absurd demand that you really feel a bit paralyzed with it.
Right. It makes a lot of sense. It would be unprecedented for an alliance like NATO to give Russia a veto over who joins the alliance. The alliance might decide one way or another on whether a country like Ukraine or Georgia should be in the alliance, but certainly to give Russia a veto would undermine the alliance, the very existence of the alliance. The other paradox, of course, is Putin's aggressive behavior and his threats make it all the more important, obviously, for Ukrainians to have NATO's support. How do you think Ukrainians would react to continued Russian aggression and a Russian invasion? Vladimir Putin claims that there is support for him in Ukraine. Is that true?
That's not really the case. I think that the best phrase to really describe the situation on the ground is really this: keep calm and carry on. It's psychologically, for instance, imagine, like you just live your life and nothing really happening, but there are these all threats and demands, everywhere. But of course, it's not just the threats. There is the 100,000 Russian troops on the Ukrainian border. It's the fact. It's been confirmed. There is a satellite. There's intelligence. So it's not a bluff, but a real threat. At the same time, because it's, let's say, I'd use this word, theoretical, there is very little you can do. So people just pursue, and there is anxiety, but the only way is like just to go on. But at the same time, of course, as a journalist, we follow up with the army, we follow up with the politicians. We know that, they're not on holidays, they are on alert, they are looking at different, options. At the same time, the morale is quite high. There is no doubt that Ukrainians would resist. Of course, not the whole country, but, people would do what is expected from them to do. So even, I would say, like, even in case Russia invade to the different parts of the Ukrainian territory, it's very hard to imagine how they would control the territory. For what they need this territory? They can't afford just to create incredible damage to the country, to the economy of the country, to the infrastructure. They are capable of that, but really to invade and expect that like people would support, that's totally unrealistic. So in the end, I use also this term of like doomed optimism we have, that it could be very difficult and challenging, but there is no even little doubt that that Ukrainians won't fight to defend itself, or that people would embrace any kind of invasion. Paradoxically, of course, there is growing support towards Ukrainian memberships in NATO, and growing alienation towards Russia in even if the people who were moderate. But just saying that, I should again say that still people quite unwilling to the conflict happen. There are no drums of war in Kiev or elsewhere.
What has been the reaction of the Ukrainian government, and has it been viewed positively on the ground?
It's different, the reaction to the government. At this point, I think I can't afford to express my opinion. I should give credit for the government to stay, let's say, calm and show restraint, which is very hard, I guess. In the situation like that, even with the political motives, it would be very easy to tune in this war mood. It just like that. However, the president and the government, they really want to avoid the panic. Oddly enough, I mean, for good or for the best, but to my opinion, it's for better. They are not really, like this. They're trying to, explain, to demonstrate this calmness in response to reassure that the government is in control, but they really, not really rushing. I know for sure that the major effort is to, get the possible support from the Western alliance. But I would explain also the thing that from the way how the Kremlin usually acts, they really try to provoke. They really try to, create this casus belli for war, do something and then accuse another side of being the ones who started. And already in this situation, there were quite a few situations when Ukraine could be this, hot-headed side which started something, and that's already explanation in the Russian propagandistic or the Russian state media. But it's not exact. It's the opposite to what's going on the ground. So the population is different. I know some of the people are complaining, oh, why, I don't know, we are that calm. Why there is not anywhere the emergency mode? But I think it's also done in order to de-escalate, because it would be very difficult to understand then, what is for us to be clear, what is the cause? But it's quite important not to, bring that chaos. So we do have more or less a calmer situation in the, let's say, Ukrainian media rather than even in the international media regarding the conflict. But as I just explained, I mean, there are other reasons for that.
And it's important for people to understand that Russia has claimed that Ukraine is acting aggressively toward it. And so, as Nataliya described, there's a concern that Russia will use an excuse, use what appears to be an act of Ukraine or another country to justify invading. What do Ukrainians think about Western and American policy in response to Putin? What would they like to see?
I think that the idea is that it's a bit too late. So indeed, Ukrainian army is under the reform process for the last years. It's developed very well, but still, it's far away from perfect. There are years necessary in order to improve the situation, and as well. I mean, if the troops are quite strong, but the navy or air defense is quite weak, and that's not something to fix So there is quite a clear list of equipment, military equipment, which is demanded, from drones to different kind of defense system. But I should insist that it's about the defense. I myself, I'm a journalist, so I'm not really like expressing strong opinions. But I'm the one who was not really a big supporter of, like sorting out the annexation of Crimea or reconquering Donbass with a military force. So I was quite a strong opinion on that we won't solve the conflict in the eastern Ukraine with more weapons because it's not there. Yet now the situation is different. We're speaking about the threat of the different scale of the invasion from a foreign country, where probably some kind of very clear types of weaponry could be used. Also, but at the same time, as we just discussed, this paradox of NATO, this idea that that things can't be decided with the participation of Ukraine. I think it partially frustrates some of the people. Why I'm speaking too late? Because of course, any support right now could be accused by Russia as a kind of a provocation. So, it could be given way earlier. The second problem is, I don't want to make it too complicated, but we're speaking about the Nord Stream 2, the gas pipeline, which is built to sell the gas in Germany. And of course, in this situation for Ukrainians, it's quite difficult to understand how at all we can build something like that in current context, because there are a lot of announcements that, it would be blocked if it would be used as a weapon, but it's already used as a weapon. So some of the Ukrainians probably would like to have stronger support, because the weakness is something which in fact provokes the Kremlin. Usually the Kremlin describes in their publications that the West won't support Ukraine. So as long as when the West demonstrate either lack of unity or lack of strength, that's something which kind of makes Russia stronger. So there is this feeling that it could be more. In the end, as we started the program, as we started the podcast, the story at this moment isn't really about Ukraine, but in the end, in the worst case scenario, that would be Ukrainians who would need to fight and who would be under the critical risk.
Right. So our final question, Nataliya, relates to a number of things you said in your really interesting answer just now. Ukraine has been dealing, of course, with the Russian invasion of Ukraine and Crimea in particular since 2014, and continued support for an insurgency in the Donbass that you mentioned before, the eastern part of Ukraine. So in a sense, Ukraine has been at war with Russia, a low-scale war, since 2014. What does that long experience of conflict with Russia and the current concerns about war, what does that do to Ukrainian democracy? Yours is a country that is developing democratic institutions. It's been difficult. You've written about this. We have our own difficulties in the United States, of course. What do these events mean for the future of Ukrainian democracy?
So the problem that there is one demand Russia wants from Ukraine in this case, not to be a democracy. And that's not what Ukrainians want to agree. That's what is really on the table. Regaining its sphere of influence for Russia means that neither Ukraine nor other is a post-Soviet or even Eastern European countries won't be democracies any longer if Russia succeeds. So that is what is on the table. That's what is at heart of this conflict. I still would insist that any war is, of course, is toxic for the societies and for the democracy in the society. It creates the pretext, for different government policies or taboos in the society. So it can't, the war can't be helpful to the society or to the country. But I still do not see any other way that Ukraine would, give up and would say like, okay, we agree, we don't want to be democracy, so please invade us. Or like, okay, we agree that we would like to have an authoritarian government, and then if it's calmed down the Russia, we would do that. We see that it sounds even silly when I pronounce that. So indeed, in the long run, it's not just about democracy in Ukraine. It's about the whole idea whether the country which decided to be democratic, a former, post-Soviet country, whether it's allowed by Russia to be democratic. And that's definitely not something we want to have in the 21st century.
Right. The basis for sovereignty and self-determination is for the people to decide, which is at the core of democracy. Zachary, this has been in the news, this topic, of course, but there's a lot going on in the world today, especially COVID and debates over voting rights in the United States, various changes and various controversies. Do you think this is a topic that young people are interested in the United States, and something that will motivate young people like yourself going forward?
I think so, to a limited extent, because I think part of the problem is that the way this conflict is being discussed in the United States is one of great power conflict and almost on Cold War terms. And I think part of the problem is that in that language, that rhetoric, we're losing sight of the people who will actually suffer on the ground if an invasion were to occur. So I do think people are engaged in the sort of high stakes diplomatic and public controversies that are ongoing at the moment. But I think there's less attention and not enough attention being paid to the actual consequences on the ground.
Right. And the complexity of American and Western responses
Indeed.
to this. Well, Nataliya, thank you for providing us an on-the-ground perspective and giving us insights, as Zachary said, to the experience of human beings on the ground, and reminding us how important this conflict and the future of Ukraine is to the future of democracy in Europe and beyond. There are not easy answers for U.S. policy, but I think you've given us a much better accounting of how we should think about the situation and how we should carefully plan for future weeks and months of potential conflict, even warfare. Thank you so much, Nataliya.
Thank you.
Thank you, Zachary, for your poem and your insights, of course, as well. And thank you most of all to our listeners for joining us for yet another week of This Is Democracy.
This podcast is produced by the Liberal Arts ITS Development Studio
and the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Texas at Austin.
The music in this episode was written and recorded by Harris Codini. Stay tuned for a new episode every week. You can find This Is Democracy on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Stitcher.
See you next time.